All right, welcome to our Bible study. We are in week number 21 of our study. We're in Romans chapter 7. We're going to be going over verses 7 through 25. So we're going to finish the rest of chapter 7 from where we left off last week, or last session, depending on when you're watching this. But basically, the only thing you need to remember to jump in here now before going back and reading or listening to the other studies is that Romans 6, 7, and 8 are basically an analogy of the Exodus. That whereas the Exodus led the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt through to their freedom through the water of the Red Sea into the Promised Land and freedom from slavery, Jesus does the same thing. Paul uses that as an analogy for Jesus leading us out of slavery to sin. We're saved through the waters of baptism into the freedom of a life as a subject, as a slave, as the bride of Christ. We're free from sin and slavery. And so that's basically the big thing that we need to remember within this. The other side of this too is the obligation side. Paul has been hammering this in the last few sections that we've looked at, that we are obligated to something as a master. If it's to sin, and then that leads to death, right? And Paul used the analogy of a slave. We're slaves to sin. He used the analogy of a marriage to a cruel husband, that we're obliged to bear the fruit of that marriage. Otherwise, we're slaves to Christ. We're married to Christ, the bride of Christ. This analogy is used everywhere in the New Testament. And so basically, Paul's point is that the law, while its true purpose of teaching and building the people of Israel into something different from the people around them so that God could then enact the rest of his great rescue plan, it did create more and new opportunities for sin to dominate and enslave. And so basically Paul is wrestling with that. What was the point of the law? How does the law live out, serve the purpose that God designed it for? And so let's start with verses 7 through 12. And so basically this section, it's talking about, picking up where we left off last week, about bearing good fruit because we are the bride of Christ as the church, bearing the good things. What was the point of the law then? So that's basically what we're discussing here. So starting in verse 7, it says, "What then shall we say? That the law is sin? Certainly not. But I would not have known sin except through the law. I would not have known covetousness if the law had not said, 'You shall not covet.' But sin grabbed its opportunity through the commandment and produced all kinds of covetousness within me. Apart from the law, sin is dead. I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin sprang to life and I died. The commandment which pointed to life turned out, in my case, to bring death. For sin grabbed its opportunity through the commandment. It deceived me and through it killed me. So then, the law is holy and the commandment is holy, upright, and good." So let's think about it like this. Alcohol can be a good thing, right? Alcohol can clean wounds. It can prevent infection. In a tight spot, it can cause numbing so that somebody can go through a painful procedure. Like maybe you have an accident that needs stitches, or a leg need reset in the wilderness and you can't get to medical. Alcohol can help get through that moment. It's safe to drink almost always because of its antiseptic properties. It can lift spirits. It can make people feel good. It can improve a mood. It's been used to celebrate milestones like weddings, or it can help you get through the grief of loss. Like, alcohol can be a good thing, but it can also be an extremely dangerous thing. It can be something that enslaves a person to it, that they become dependent on it. In which case, once that addiction to alcohol takes hold, it ruins not only the life of the person addicted, but it can ruin everybody else in their life. You cannot look at alcohol and say it is purely evil. You can't. Now, somebody who's been damaged by it may look at it and say, "Yeah, it's nothing but evil. I can't touch it." And for them, it would be. But the reality of it is, alcohol is not existentially evil. I guarantee that you exist because of alcohol. As a matter of fact, if we look back through history, especially in the West, a lot of water wasn't safe to drink, and we know that in America even, the reason that alcohol was so prolific was because it was the only truly safe drinking water. It wasn't water, but it was safe to drink. And so a lot of people who exist today only exist because their ancestors survived because alcohol sustained them. And again, this is not me saying that everybody should go drink alcohol. This is not the point of this illustration. The point is, we can look at things and say, it can do damage, therefore it must be evil. But that's not usually the case. Most things are all about the way in which they're used, whether it's medicine. If it's a good thing, we call it medicine. If it's abused, we call it drugs. If it's a gun in the hand of a protector, like a policeman who's protecting somebody, it's a good thing. If it's in the hand of a criminal attacking somebody, it's a bad thing. If nuclear power is used to create energy and sustain culture, and it's a good thing. But if it's used to destroy, it's a bad thing. It's about the way in which it's used. And Paul's point here, talking about the law, is essentially the same thing. The law is not evil. It's actually a good thing designed to teach Israel how to be holy and to avoid sin. But as it was a tool for improving life, it was used as a weapon for also destroying life. See, sin, it took the law, it took the commandments, and it used it to cause more sin and therefore corrupt. And as sin corrupts, it continues to corrupt and spread like an infection. Whereas something wasn't sin before the law, it is now. Let's look at an example, right? This is the one that always jumps to my mind. Leviticus 19:19. It says, you are to keep my decrees. So this is God saying, you are to keep my laws, right? This is specifically to the people of Israel, those under the Mosaic commandment. He says, you will not mate two kinds of animals. You will not sow your fields with two kinds, and you will not put cloth woven of two kinds onto yourself. So basically what this commandment says, and this was one that the Israelites kept, was they don't breed two different kinds of animals, they don't sow a field with two different kinds of crops, and they don't make any materials out of two different kinds of cloth or sewing material, whatever. So that means basically you can have no mules, because that's a combination between a horse and a donkey, right? You can't have gardens that have multiple things in them, and you can't have polyester blends, right? You can't have things that are made out of multiple types of materials, clothing. Before that law was given, there was nothing wrong with mules and gardens and polyester blends. Not that any of those things necessarily existed way back when. But once it was given, they now become sin. And you might be like, well, aren't these rules pointless? They may even borderline on harmful. I mean, crops tend to grow better with variety, right? The Native Americans planted the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, and those three complemented each other, and they grew better because they were planted together. Mules are more beneficial in ways that donkeys aren't and horses aren't, Mules can be better use in certain scenarios. Blended fabrics tend to be better than single material fabrics, right? Why give this commandment at all? Well, the purpose of the law is to teach, right? We've said that over and over. And these commands, they're not moral commands, right? These aren't thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not murder, right? They're not those kind of commands that have a clear moral implication. These commands were given to teach, because that's the purpose of the law, to teach the Israelites how to be holy. They aren't moral, they're ceremonial and instructional. Israel needed to be single-minded. They needed to be single-minded in their worship of God, because when they start incorporating other things, other cultures, other traditions into their worship, into their lifestyle, it leads them down a path that corrupts them away from God. And it did. This isn't a unfounded hypothetical. It absolutely did. It absolutely happened. And so the point of this commandment is not that mules are evil, gardens with multiple vegetables in them are evil, or that polyester blends are evil. No, that's not the point. It's not a moral issue. It's an instructional issue. It's a teaching issue. And every parent does this exact same thing, right? You tell your kids, share your toys. Don't be selfish. Don't say mean things. Don't say bad words. Go to bed at bedtime. You have a strict bedtime, or eat all your food, clean your plate, right? We tell our kids these things. Why? Because these rules teach kids principles we want them to grow into. It's not that these rules are meant to be followed as an adult. I don't expect a grown-up to have to share all their toys, right? I don't expect a grown-up to always be really nice. No, sometimes there is a need for gruff and aggression, right? That's why we have cops and soldiers. There are times when that's necessary. As a grown-up, I can go to bed whenever I want. I like to go to bed early, but it's not essential. It's not a rule for me. I don't have to eat all my food. As a matter of fact, the older I get, the less food I should eat, right? The rules were meant to teach things to kids the same way God gave these types of rules to Israel to teach them to be different. He was raising them into a nation, and at the time, they needed to learn these lessons. And before and after the period where these rules were enacted, they weren't sin. They're not sin now, and they weren't sin before. My infants didn't have to share their toys, go to bed at a certain time, or not say any bad words. I'm pretty sure one of my infants, I'm pretty sure they said some awful mean things to me at certain points during tantrums, but I didn't know what it was. They couldn't get in trouble for it. That's the point here. And so the rules, they're good things. They're used to teach. But when they're broken, they cause guilt. When before and after, they wouldn't cause guilt. They wouldn't be a rule to be broken, but during, they absolutely would be. The rules are good, but they can be used to cause guilt and deserve punishment, which is Paul's next point, starting in verse 13. He says, was it that good thing then that brought death to me? Certainly not. On the contrary, working through the good thing and producing death in me, certainly on the contrary, it was sin in order that it might appear as sin, working through the good thing and producing death in me. This was in order that sin might become very sinful indeed through the commandment. We know, you see, that the law is spiritual. I, however, am made of flesh, sold as a slave under sin's authority. I don't understand what I do. I don't do what I want, you see, but I do what I hate. So if I do what I don't want to do, I am agreeing that the law is good. When you do something wrong, it shows up physically. If you've done something really wrong in your life, you know what I'm talking about. Sometimes you can shake, sometimes you sweat, you have a raised heart rate, raised blood pressure, feelings of anxiety, failure to sleep, you have insomnia. It shows up physically. As a matter of fact, this is how lie detectors work. They rely on your body's physical reaction to a lie or doing something wrong. Now, there are ways to get around lie detector tests, which is why they're inadmissible in a court case. One way is to create a masking physical response. We've seen in movies and stuff where people will put a tack in their shoe, and when they have to answer a question, they've already stepping on it. They're causing an elevated blood pressure, like all the things it's looking for are already happening, so you can't tell the lie. The other way is to not have a physical response. In other words, you actually believe the lie you're telling, or you don't think what you did is wrong. And folks who are able to do the second thing, they tend to fall under some sort of mental disorder or a diagnosis of some kind. They have to be able to detach from reality so that their body physically doesn't respond. When a person knowingly sins, they basically have one of those two reactions. They either don't think what they did was wrong and therefore feel no guilt, or they know what they did was wrong and they experience guilt. They experience the emotions, the physical response of having done something wrong. And Paul's point here is that he says when he fails to keep the law, he experiences guilt because he knows it was wrong. He experiences the guilt as evidence. He says this guilt that when I do the things of the law that I don't want to do and I don't do the things I should do, well, they say that shows that's the evidence that the law is good. Otherwise, I wouldn't feel this guilt. He says that that's the evidence that the law is good. And then he continues on and he expands this idea in regards to the law of grace, the law of love. He says in verse 17, but it is no longer I that do it. It's sin living within me. I know, you see, that no good thing lives in me, that is in my human flesh. For I can will the good, but I can't perform it. For I don't do the thing I want to do, but I end up doing the evil thing I don't want to do. So if I do what I don't want to do, it is no longer I doing it, it's sin living within me. See, here basically Paul harkens back to chapter 6, verse 11, where he says, in the same way, you too must calculate, count, consider, reckon, think of yourselves as being dead to sin and alive to God in the Messiah Jesus. That we have been made new, right? It's the math of salvation, right? It's the transformation of salvation. And it can be confusing despite its simplicity, right? In our BC days, before Christ, we have a corrupted body, a corrupted spirit. Like we are corrupted, depending on how that corruption happens, born, it happens after you grow up. I don't know, like you can argue that out in your theological discourses and research. But the point is, we as adults, as people who are responsible for our own actions, we are all corrupted in body and soul and spirit. And we have no experience of life. We have no experience of what it means to truly be alive. We are the walking dead. That is the way that Paul and Jesus describe human beings before they experience salvation, before they experience grace. We are the walking dead. We have no experience of life. We are completely at the control of the powers that be around us, the evil spiritual powers that be around us, and the corrupting influence that they have instilled in us, in our bodies and in our souls. But then after conversion, AC, we're made new in soul and spirit. We are a new thing, a new creation, but we still reside inside this corrupted body, inside this corrupted flesh. Sin drives the flesh because it's what's been drilled into it, but the spirit drives our mind, right? And that's really what Paul is talking about, how we have this corrupted flesh, this corrupted nature, if you will. And it is the thing that causes us to sin, because that is who we used to be. But because we calculate and recognize that we are now a new thing, well, we're no longer that, right? We are the new thing, but we still have to fight with this corrupted flesh. We are not remade sinful at our conversion, but we are still capable of sin because of sin that dwells within us. That's what Paul is saying here. Now, it's at this point I need to make sure we understand what Paul is doing here is illustrating the point of the corrupting influence of sin. Not that our flesh and our mind and our soul and spirit are just completely different entities. That's not what he's saying. That's not what the Bible teaches. Paul uses this language to make sure that we understand his point, that we have parts of us that are temporary and corrupted that will be done away with, that he calls the flesh, and then there are parts of us that are new and will last on into eternity, and that's our spirit, that's our mind, that's our soul. And so basically the point here that I'm getting at is while we are remade, we still have to fight this fight. All sin done by us, done to us, done around us has that physically corrupting effect. And this in turn has a mentally and spiritually corrupting effect. They're very related. You cannot separate the two. For example, if you're really out of shape, or you eat just tons and tons of junk food, or you lay around just way too much, or you get sick, or you get an injury, you stub your toe, or you break an arm or something, you feel it mentally as much as you do physically, right? Like you feel mentally, you feel spiritually drained or hurt or down. You cannot separate the flesh from the spirit. They are attached. They are connected. Our bodies and our minds are linked. How we treat one absolutely affects the other. That's why Paul repeatedly said, don't present your limbs and organs to sin to be used by sin, because they will cause you to sin. It will cause a corrupting effect on your heart and your mind. And he says, think only on things that are pure and holy and spiritual and good. Like Jesus and Paul both, they make this clear that the body and the mind and the soul, they're connected. And so we can't present either side of us to sin, but we have to count ourselves as the new thing. That's the whole point here, is that we have to recognize that we are a new thing and don't pretend like we're not, because that is where we cause sin to take root in our lives as we do this fight against it. And so on that note, we get to verse 21, where it says, this then is what I find about the law. When I want to do what is right, evil lies close at hand. I delight in God's law, you see, according to my inmost self. But I see another law in my limbs and organs, fighting a battle against the law of my mind and taking me off into captivity. There's that Exodus reference again, in the law of sin, which is in my limbs and organs. What a miserable person I am. Who is going to rescue me from the body of this death? Thank God through Jesus our Messiah and Lord. So then left to my own self, I am enslaved to God's law with my mind, but to sin's law with my human flesh. Basically, Paul is saying we're in a fight that you and we cannot win. And he says as much in chapter 7, verse 19, or here in verses 22 through 24. He can't win the fight, and neither can we. All of us are helpless to win this fight without Jesus. The desire to sin it comes from the corruption that's in all of us, that from being on this corrupted planet, sin done to us, done by us, done around us, it physically corrupts us. It causes us to have a penchant for sin, that we desire to sin. And we can't win that fight because it's too overwhelming. And if you read about dealing with temptation to sin, not sin itself, but temptation to sin, it says to flee from opportunities for it, right? It gets back to our alcohol illustration, that if you're somebody where alcohol has become an addiction or a stronghold for the enemy, a sin in your life, then you have to flee situations where it can take root. You cannot go to the bar. Sorry. You cannot go to that wedding where they're serving. Sorry. Like, that's just part and parcel. If you struggle with certain things like porn or drugs or lying or cheating, you cannot put yourself in situations where that can manifest. You can't do that. It's just plain and simple. You have to flee from it. Jesus said in Matthew 26:41, watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Basically the same thing Paul is teaching here. Paul says elsewhere in 1 Corinthians 10:13, no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation, he will also provide a way of escape that you may be able to endure it. Paul is saying, hey, it's not that any temptation, you're going to have the strength over it. No, he says, God will give you an escape. You just have to take it. Like, we're not to sit there and fight temptation. James says the same thing. Peter says the same. You read the New Testament, it says over and over, don't fight temptation. Avoid it. Run from it. Flee from it. It's what the Lord's Prayer says. Run from temptation. Because our flesh is weak and will give in. And we are in a fight that we cannot afford to lose. But it's only through the Spirit and the Spirit's teaching and transformative work in our lives that we can escape it and escape sin. Our only hope is Jesus. It's his faithfulness that saves us on a moment-by-moment basis. And we respond to that by avoiding temptation and making sure we abide in Christ, that we abide in the Spirit, that we focus on the things that are good and pure and holy and things that will last into eternity. And we don't present ourselves to sin to be used as a tool for death, the way Paul describes. And so my challenge to you with this study is to look at the areas of your life where you're giving sin a foothold. Are there things you're watching, things you're seeing, things you're listening to that are giving sin a foothold? It doesn't mean everything that you listen to that isn't Christian is bad for you. Like, if you listen to AC/DC, it might be okay for you. But if it is a problem for you, maybe you need to cut that out. Maybe listening to certain music or watching certain movies or watching certain TV shows or spending certain time scrolling on Facebook or social media, TikTok, whatever. Like, if you're giving sin a foothold and it leads to more sin, Paul's saying you need to avoid that because you're not going to win that fight. It's not about being strong enough. You're not. It's about relying on Christ's strength and removing yourself as a potential slave for sin. So hopefully this helps you understand chapter 7 of Romans a little bit better. If you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, see you next time.